Every night for 3 years, 7 months, and 16 days, Evangeline Eva Hartwell walked the quarter-mile from her weathered cabin to the railroad tracks that cut through the Montana wilderness like a steel lifeline to civilization. In her hands, she carried the same flickering candle, protected by a glass chimney that had somehow survived countless windstorms and bitter winter nights. At precisely 8 o'clock, when the westbound freight train was scheduled to pass through, Eva would light her candle and hold it high beside the tracks, a small beacon of hope in the vast darkness of the frontier night. The train always thundered past without slowing, its whistle a lonely cry that seemed to mock her desperate vigil. But Eva never missed a night, not when she was burning with fever, not when snow drifted waist-deep around the tracks, not when her heart felt too broken to continue breathing. The townspeople of Cedar Bend, 15 miles down the line, had long since dismissed Eva as the crazy candle woman whose grief had driven her to madness. They whispered about her at church socials and general store gatherings, shaking their heads with the mixture of pity and irritation reserved for those who refused to accept their circumstances gracefully. But Eva's vigil was neither madness nor mere grief. It was hope, stubborn, relentless hope that someday someone would see her signal and understand that she needed rescue, not just from her physical isolation, but from an injustice that had stolen her life as surely as if she had been buried alive. The injustice had a name: Judge Cornelius Blackwood, Eva's own uncle, who had used his position and influence to steal everything that mattered to her. After her husband's death, when Samuel Hartwell died in a mining accident, leaving Eva with a prosperous ranch and a future full of promise, Judge Blackwood had swooped in like a vulture, using forged documents and corrupt legal proceedings to claim that Samuel's debts exceeded his assets and that Eva was mentally incompetent to manage her own affairs. Within 6 months of Samuel's funeral, Eva had lost her ranch, her cattle, her savings, and even her right to leave the territory without the judge's permission. She had been deemed a woman of unstable mind and placed under her uncle's guardianship, effectively making her a prisoner in her own life. The cabin where Eva now lived was a deliberate insult, a one-room shack on worthless land that Judge Blackwood had graciously provided for his mentally deficient niece. He visited monthly to ensure she was still properly isolated and broken, bringing with him just enough supplies to keep her alive, but not enough to make life comfortable. "Evangeline," he would say in his oily, patronizing voice, "I do hope you're learning to accept your circumstances with proper Christian resignation. Pride was always your weakness, my dear. Perhaps this humbling experience will teach you the virtues of gratitude and submission." Eva endured these visits in silence, having learned that any protest or argument was used as further evidence of her unstable mind. But she never stopped planning, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that someday her signal would be seen by someone with the power and courage to help her reclaim her stolen life. The candle ritual had begun almost by accident. During her first lonely winter in the cabin, Eva had taken comfort in the distant sound of the passing train, the reminder that somewhere beyond her prison walls, life continued. People traveled freely, stories unfolded without the crushing weight of injustice. One night, seized by desperate impulse, she had run to the tracks with a lit candle, hoping against hope that someone might see her signal and investigate. The train had roared past without slowing, but something about the act of signaling had given Eva a sense of purpose she desperately needed. If she couldn't escape her circumstances, she could at least maintain hope for rescue. If she couldn't speak her truth to those around her, she could at least send her plea into the night, trusting that eventually someone would answer. So began the ritual that kept Eva alive through 3 of the darkest years of her life. Every night at 8 o'clock, she lit her candle and held it high, a beacon of faith in the midst of despair, a signal that someone, somewhere, was in need of help. On this particular October evening, as Eva walked her familiar path to the tracks, she had no way of knowing that tonight would be different. She had no way of knowing that the westbound freight was running late due to mechanical problems, or that it carried a passenger who was about to change everything. Captain James Mitchell, recently retired from the Union Pacific Railroad after 20 years of distinguished service, was riding in the engineer's cab as a courtesy. making his final journey on the rails that had been his life's work. At 52, James was a man of integrity and keen observation, qualities that had made him one of the most respected railroad men in the territory. Strange, James said to engineer Pete Morrison as they approached the isolated stretch of track near Cedar Bend. "Do you see that light up ahead?" Pete squinted through the darkness and nodded. "Looks like someone with a lantern. Probably just a homesteader checking on livestock." But as they drew closer, James could see that the figure beside the tracks was a woman holding what appeared to be a candle, rather than a practical lantern. She stood perfectly still as the massive locomotive approached, not moving away from the tracks, but not stepping into danger either. There was something about her posture, dignified, patient, almost ritualistic, that caught James's attention. "Pete," James said suddenly, "I want you to stop the train." "Stop?" Pete looked at him in surprise. "Captain, we're already running 2 hours behind schedule. The dispatcher will have our heads if we make any more delays." "Stop the train." "Pete, that woman has been signaling us for a reason, and I intend to find out what it is." Years of working under James Mitchell had taught Pete to trust the man's instincts, even when they seemed to go against common sense. With a resigned sigh, he began applying the brakes, and the massive freight train slowly ground to a halt just yards from where Eva stood with her flickering candle. Eva's heart nearly stopped as she realized what was happening. After 3 years of faithful vigil, a train was actually stopping. Someone had seen her signal. Someone cared enough to investigate. James climbed down from the engineer's cab and approached Eva slowly, his experienced eyes taking in her neat but worn clothing, her dignified bearing despite obvious poverty, and the mixture of hope and terror in her expression. "Ma'am," James said, touching the brim of his cap respectfully, "I'm Captain James Mitchell with the Union Pacific. I've been watching you signal our trains for some time now, and I finally decided to find out what you need." Eva stared at him in amazement, hardly able to believe that her vigil had finally been answered. You've seen me before. This stretch of track is part of my regular route." James explained gently. "I've noticed you out here with your candle many times over the past few months. It takes dedication to maintain such a regular schedule, and I figured anyone that persistent must have something important to communicate." Eva felt tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the miracle of this moment. "Sir, I've been waiting so long for someone to stop. I need help desperately. But I don't know if you'll believe me." James studied her face in the candlelight, seeing intelligence, sincerity, and deep suffering in her expression. "Ma'am, why don't you start by telling me your name and what kind of help you need?" "My name is Eva Hartwell," Eva said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm being held prisoner by my uncle, Judge Cornelius Blackwood, who has stolen my property and declared me mentally incompetent. I've been signaling the trains for 3 years, hoping someone would stop and listen to my story." James felt a chill run down his spine at the mention of Judge Blackwood's name. He had heard rumors about the man's corrupt practices, but like most people, he had dismissed them as unsubstantiated gossip. Looking at Eva's earnest face, he began to suspect that the rumors might have been understatements. "Mrs. Hartwell," James said carefully, "these are serious accusations. If what you're saying is true, you're describing criminal acts that would warrant federal investigation. I have proof," Eva said quickly, reaching into her coat pocket. "I've been collecting evidence for 3 years, documents that show the forgeries, witness statements from people who knew my husband's actual financial situation, letters that prove my uncle's real motives." She handed James a carefully wrapped packet of papers that she had been carrying every night for months, hoping for exactly this opportunity. James examined the documents by the light of Eva's candle, his expression growing grimmer with each page. The evidence was damning, clear proof of document forgery, witness tampering, and abuse of judicial authority. "Mrs. Hartwell," James said finally, "I believe you're telling the truth, and I think I know how we can get you the help you need." After 3 long years of faithful vigil, Eva's prayers are finally being answered. Are you feeling the emotion of this incredible moment? This story of persistence, faith, and unexpected rescue is just getting started. If you're loving Eva's journey from despair to hope, Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss how this amazing story unfolds. Now, let's return to our tale and see how Captain Mitchell will help Eva reclaim her stolen life. Mrs. Hartwell, James said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making decisive choices under pressure. I'm going to help you get justice, but it's going to require courage and trust on your part. Are you prepared for that? Eva clutched her packet of evidence closer to her chest, hardly daring to hope that her 3-year nightmare might finally be coming to an end. Captain Mitchell, I've had nothing but courage and trust to sustain me through these years. I'm ready for whatever needs to be done. James nodded approvingly. Good. First, I need you to understand something about your uncle that you may not know. Judge Blackwood's corruption extends far beyond what he's done to you. He's been taking bribes to influence railroad land grants, and the Union Pacific has been building a case against him for months. Your evidence might be exactly what we need to bring him down. The railroad has been investigating my uncle. We've suspected him of corruption for over a year. James explained, but we haven't had enough concrete evidence to act. Blackwood is careful to cover his tracks, and he has enough legitimate influence to make accusations dangerous without ironclad proof. Eva felt a surge of vindication at learning that her uncle's corruption was known beyond her isolated circumstances. So you believe my story, Mrs. Hartwell? I've spent 20 years learning to read people, and everything about you suggests honesty and intelligence. More importantly, your evidence corroborates information we've been gathering independently. James paused to consider their options. Here's what I propose. I'm going to take you to Denver, where you can present your case to federal authorities who are outside your uncle's sphere of influence. But first, we need to get you away from here safely. Eva's heart leaped at the prospect of finally escaping her isolated prison. How? My uncle has told everyone in the county that I'm mentally unstable and dangerous. If they see me trying to leave, they'll see you traveling under the protection of a Union Pacific captain. Unofficial railroad business, James said firmly. I have the authority to commandeer transportation for witnesses in federal investigations. Your uncle's local influence won't extend to federal railroad matters. 20 minutes later, Eva found herself seated in the comfort of the train's passenger car, watching the landscape that had been her prison for 3 years slide past the window. She clutched a cup of hot coffee that Engineer Pete had kindly provided, marveling at the simple pleasure of being warm, safe, and moving toward freedom. Mrs. Hartwell, James said, settling into the seat across from her. While we travel, I'd like you to tell me everything you can remember about your husband's death and the events that followed. The more details you can provide, the stronger case we can build against your uncle. For the next 4 hours, as the train carried them through the night toward Denver, Eva told her complete story. She spoke of her happy marriage to Samuel, their prosperous ranch, and the mining accident that had taken his life so suddenly. She detailed her uncle's swift and ruthless seizure of her assets, the forged documents that supposedly proved Samuel's debts, and the corrupt legal proceedings that had declared her incompetent. James listened with growing anger and admiration. Anger at the calculated cruelty of Judge Blackwood's actions, and admiration for Eva's strength in surviving such an ordeal without losing her sanity or her hope. One thing puzzles me, James said as Eva's narrative drew to a close. Why didn't you try to contact authorities sooner? Surely you must have realized that your uncle's actions were illegal. Eva's expression grew bitter. Captain Mitchell, who would have believed the word of a woman declared mentally incompetent against that of a respected judge? My uncle was very careful to establish my unstable reputation before he began stealing from me. Any complaint I made would have been dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. James felt a surge of protective anger at the systematic way Eva had been isolated and silenced. Well, that's going to change. By the time we're finished, your uncle will discover that federal law doesn't recognize his local authority to declare anyone incompetent without proper medical and legal procedures. When they arrived in Denver the next morning, James wasted no time in taking Eva to the offices of Federal Marshal Robert Harrison, a man he knew to be incorruptible and thorough in his investigations. Captain Mitchell, Marshal Harrison said, rising from his desk to greet them, "This is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you to Denver? Official business, Marshal. I'd like to present Mrs. Evangeline Hartwell, a witness in what I believe will prove to be a significant corruption case involving Judge Cornelius Blackwood. Marshal Harrison's eyebrows rose at the mention of Blackwood's name. We've had our suspicions about the judge for some time. What kind of evidence does Mrs. Hartwell have over the next 3 hours? Eva presented her documentation to a team of federal investigators, legal experts, and railroad officials as she laid out her evidence and told her story. Eva watched the expressions of the officials change from skepticism to amazement to righteous anger. Mrs. Hartwell, Marshal Harrison said when she had finished, "This is one of the most comprehensive collections of evidence I've ever seen from a private citizen. How did you manage to gather all this while living under your uncle's control?" "I had 3 years and very little else to do," Eva replied with dry humor. "My uncle's arrogance worked against him. He never imagined that his mentally incompetent niece might be documenting his crimes." Dr. Margaret Thornton, a physician who had been called in to evaluate Eva's mental state, looked up from her notes with obvious admiration. "Mrs. Hartwell, I want to state for the record that you show no signs whatsoever of mental instability or incompetence. In fact, your ability to maintain hope and purpose under such circumstances suggests remarkable psychological strength." "Thank you, Doctor," Eva said quietly. "It means more than you know to have someone in authority confirm my sanity." Marshal Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious but encouraging. "Mrs. Hartwell, based on your evidence and our own investigation, we're prepared to move forward with federal charges against Judge Blackwood. But I need to warn you, he's not going to surrender quietly. This case will be public, controversial, and potentially dangerous. Are you prepared for that?" Eva thought of the lonely nights beside the railroad tracks, the flickering candle that had sustained her hope through 3 years of imprisonment and despair. "Marshal Harrison, I've been preparing for this fight every night for 3 years. I'm ready." The federal investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Within a week, Judge Blackwood found him under arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, bribery, and abuse of judicial authority. The evidence Eva had meticulously collected proved to be the cornerstone of a case that exposed corruption reaching far beyond her personal situation. Federal authorities have uncovered a pattern of corruption involving illegal land transfers, bribery in railroad deals, and systematic theft from widows and estates, reported the Denver Post. The case began when Mrs. Evangeline Hartwell, previously declared mentally incompetent by Judge Blackwood, presented evidence of her uncle's crimes to federal investigators. The revelation that Eva had been falsely declared incompetent while actually gathering evidence of her uncle's corruption captured the public imagination. Suddenly, the crazy candle woman became a symbol of persistence and courage in the face of injustice. But for Eva, the most meaningful vindication came when she stood in the courtroom and heard the judge read the verdict, guilty on all charges. Judge Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, and all his assets were frozen pending restitution to his victims. "Mrs. Hartwell," the judge continued, "this court hereby declares that the previous ruling of mental incompetence was fraudulent and void. Your property rights are fully restored, and you are entitled to reclaim all assets unlawfully taken from you." As Eva walked out of the courthouse a free woman, she found James Mitchell waiting for her on the steps. Over the weeks of investigation and trial, their professional relationship had deepened into genuine friendship and something that might become more. "So, Mrs. Hartwell," James said with a gentle smile, "what will you do now that you have your life back?" Eva looked out at the bustling streets of Denver, then back at this good man who had literally stopped a train to answer her call for help. "I think, Captain Mitchell, that I'd like to build a new life. The old one was stolen from me, but perhaps that's an opportunity rather than just a tragedy." "And where will you build this new life?" James asked, his tone carefully casual. Eva smiled, feeling truly happy for the first time in 3 years. "Wherever there are people who believe in stopping to help when someone signals for assistance. Wherever there are men who understand that sometimes the greatest courage lies in simply answering when someone asks for help." James felt his heart skip a beat at the implications of her words. "Eva, Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying, James Mitchell, that you were the train that finally stopped. And if you're willing, I'd like to find out where this particular journey might take us." As they walked together through the streets of Denver, planning Eva's return to her reclaimed ranch and discussing the future they might build together, Eva marveled at how completely her life had changed. The woman who had stood beside the railroad tracks with a flickering candle was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more grateful for the power of persistence and faith. She had lit a candle for 3 years, and finally, someone had seen her light and chosen to stop. But more than that, James had seen not just her need for rescue, but her strength, her worth, and her potential for happiness. Sometimes, Eva reflected, the most important journey begins when someone finally decides to stop and see what you've been trying to signal all along. 6 months after Judge Blackwood's conviction, Eva stood on the front porch of her reclaimed ranch house, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. The property that had been stolen from her was thriving once again, under her careful management, but more importantly, it had become a home in ways it had never been before. James Mitchell had resigned from his position with the Union Pacific Railroad to help Eva rebuild her ranch and her life. What had begun as a professional courtesy extended to a crime victim had evolved into a deep and abiding love that surprised them both with its intensity and naturalness. "The evening train will be coming through soon," James said, joining Eva on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "Do you ever miss your vigil by the tracks?" Eva smiled at the question that had become something of a gentle joke between them. "Sometimes I think about those nights, but not with sadness. They were necessary, James. Every single one of them was necessary to bring me to where I am now." Indeed, Eva's transformation from victim to survivor to advocate had been remarkable. To witness, the publicity surrounding her case had brought attention to the plight of women who had been similarly victimized by corrupt legal guardianships, and Eva had become a voice for reform and justice. "Mrs. Mitchell is here," called out young Tommy Patterson from the yard, where he was playing with 3 other children whose mothers had sought refuge at Eva's ranch. Eva had opened her home to women who found themselves in circumstances similar to what she had experienced. Widows whose property had been seized by unscrupulous relatives, women declared incompetent by corrupt officials, and others who needed a safe place to rebuild their lives and fight for justice. "Tell her we'll be right in," Eva called back, then turned to James with the warm smile that never failed to make his heart skip a beat. "Are you ready for this evening's lesson?" One of Eva's most meaningful projects was teaching other women to recognize and document evidence of corruption, to understand their legal rights, and to build the kind of systematic case that had secured her own freedom. Every Tuesday evening, women from across the county gathered in Eva's parlor to learn from her experience and support each other's battles for justice. "Ladies," Eva said as she entered the parlor where 8 women sat with notebooks and determined expressions, "tonight we're going to discuss how to protect important documents and ensure they can't be destroyed or stolen by people who want to silence you." Margaret Turner, a young widow whose late husband's business partner was trying to claim her property, raised her hand tentatively. "Mrs. Mitchell, what if we can't get anyone to listen to us? What if the local authorities are all corrupt?" Eva exchanged a meaningful glance with James before answering. "Margaret, let me tell you about the power of persistence. For 3 years, I stood by railroad tracks with a candle, signaling for help. Dozens of trains passed without stopping, but I never gave up because I knew that eventually someone would see my signal and care enough to investigate." "But how did you keep hope alive for so long?" asked Sarah Collins, whose brother-in-law was trying to have her declared mentally unstable to gain control of her inheritance. "Because I understood something important," Eva replied. "Hope isn't a feeling, it's a choice. Every night when I lit that candle, I was choosing to believe that justice existed somewhere in the world, that good people existed who would help if they knew what was happening. Faith isn't about feeling confident, it's about acting with purpose, even when you're afraid." James watched from the doorway as Eva conducted her informal school of justice, marveling at the woman who had emerged from 3 years of imprisonment, stronger and more compassionate than ever. She had transformed her suffering into strength, her isolation into advocacy, her despair into hope for others. After the meeting concluded and the women had departed with renewed determination and practical knowledge, Eva and James sat together in their parlor, planning the next day's work on the ranch and discussing the latest letter from federal authorities about new corruption cases that might benefit from Eva's expertise. "Eva," James said, setting aside the correspondence, "I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll be completely honest with me." Eva looked up from her needlework with curiosity. "Of course. What is it? Do you ever regret the path that brought us together? I know that if Judge Blackwood hadn't been corrupt, if your husband hadn't died, if you hadn't been forced to signal from those railroad tracks, we never would have met. Does that make our happiness feel somehow wrong?" Eva set down her sewing and moved to sit beside James on the sofa, taking his hands in hers. "James, I've thought about that question many times, and here's what I've concluded. I can't change the past, and I wouldn't want to if it meant losing what we have now. Samuel's death was a tragedy, and my uncle's cruelty was a terrible injustice. But those experiences taught me things about strength, about hope, about the importance of fighting for what's right." She paused, looking into his eyes with the depth of love that still amazed him. "More importantly, those experiences prepared me to recognize true goodness when I found it. A woman who had never faced adversity might not have appreciated the courage it took for you to stop that train. Someone who had never been betrayed might not have understood the precious value of a man who keeps his promises." James brought her hands to his lips and kissed them gently. "I love you, Eva Mitchell, not in spite of what you've been through, but including everything that made you who you are. And I love you for seeing a signal in the darkness and caring enough to stop," Eva replied, "for understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply pay attention when someone is asking for help." As they sat together in the comfort of their home, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together, Eva reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect content. Met the desperate woman who had stood beside railroad tracks with a flickering candle seemed like someone from another lifetime. Yet Eva carried her strength and determination forward into every new day. The sound of the evening train's whistle echoed across the valley, and Eva smiled at the familiar sound that now represented not desperation, but the interconnectedness of lives, and the possibility that help could come from the most unexpected directions. "Do you think, Eva," asked James as they prepared for bed, "that our story might inspire other people who are facing impossible situations?" "I think," James replied, "that your 3 years of faithful signaling prove that persistence and hope can literally stop trains. If that's not inspiration for people facing adversity, I don't know what would be." Years later, when Eva's autobiography was published to national acclaim, readers across the country wrote to tell her how her story had given them courage to continue fighting their own battles against injustice. The image of a lone woman with a candle refusing to give up hope became a symbol of persistence and faith that transcended the specific circumstances of her case. But for Eva, the most meaningful legacy of her experience wasn't the fame or the legal precedents her case had established. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had transformed her suffering into service, her isolation into advocacy for others who needed someone to believe in their signals for help. Every evening, as she and James watched the sunset from their porch, Eva would think about the woman she had been and the woman she had become. She had lit a candle in the darkness for 3 years, never knowing when or if someone would stop. But when the right person finally saw her signal, everything changed. James had been the train that stopped, but Eva had been the light that guided them both home to a love and life neither of them could have imagined. Together, they had proven that sometimes the most profound journeys begin when someone finally decides to pay attention to the signals that others have learned to ignore. In a world that often seemed indifferent to individual suffering, Eva and James had created a beacon of hope that reminded others that persistence matters, that justice exists, and that love can bloom even in the darkest circumstances when two people choose to stop, listen, and care for each other. The candle by the tracks had been extinguished long ago, but the light it represented continued to shine in the lives they had built together and the hope they had kindled in countless others who learned that sometimes salvation comes not with thunder and lightning, but with the simple courage of someone who chooses to stop when they see a signal in the darkness. What an incredible journey from desperate signaling to triumphant love. Eva's 3 years of faith and James's decision to finally stop have created not just a beautiful love story, but a beacon of hope for anyone facing seemingly impossible circumstances. Thank you for joining us on this amazing tale of persistence, justice, and unexpected love. If Eva's story of never giving up inspired you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to remember that help can come from the most unexpected places.